Give me liberty and give me Annette.
Welcome to Annette on Life, Liberty, and Happiness, a podcast where I talk about the Constitution, history, politics, and pretty much anything else I want to talk about. And today we're definitely in the anything else category. And I decided to choose a fun topic because here we are at the end of 2020 and we're in December and I want some fun things to talk about. And so it turns out that I have a good friend, Noell Chesney. Hi, Noell.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Who's written a really fun book that I'm going to try and show here. Okay. And this is All That This Entails by Noell Chesney, which is one of my favorite types of book, which is that it's not a remake. What do you call this, Noell? It's a Jane Austen, but...
It's a Jane Austen variation.
Variation, okay.
Yeah.
Because there is a genre, isn't there? That's there's a name for that. What's that?
Fan fiction is often what it's called as well.
Fan fiction, that's right. I was reading the blog post that you shared on Facebook the other day where she was reviewing your book. And I remember she said that. And I was like, oh, I didn't know that was a thing.
Yep. I didn't know it was a thing until I started reading this over, 12, 15 years ago or whatever, that was there. And it's for all sorts of it. There's Harry Potter fan fiction and there's, of course, new ones, Game of Thrones fan fiction and all sorts, depending on what the series is. But a lot of Jane Austen fan fiction.
Yeah, I was thinking when I was reading this that I will pretty much read anything Jane Austen related or Sherlock Holmes related.
Oh, Sherlock Holmes, yeah. That's good.
And so that's good fan fiction too. But you never know. And one of the points that that lady that reviewed you made was that you can tell sometimes by the cover. And this is a really great cover, like she mentioned, because you can tell it's not a bodice ripper or anything like that, and classy. And I knew you well enough to know that it was classy because, I was very surprised one day. I'm going to go off on a tangent a little bit here, but I saw something on Prime that was Jane Austen related, or no, it was the Bronte sisters. And I thought, oh, that's going to be good because you always expect those kinds of things to be clean. No. Within about the first 5 minutes, someone dropped the F-bomb. I was shocked. I was like, what? I mean, okay, I know that the word existed back then, but you just don't find it in those books. The Brontes were not swearing. Jane Austen does not have swearing.
No, not at all.
Any of that
Very
stuff.
clean.
And so obviously your book does not have any of that. And so first, when we were talking about this the other day and I was asking you what got you started down this road. So tell us how this all came about.
Sure. So I've always loved Jane Austen, at least since high school. I think that's when I kind of discovered her. That's when the movies Emma came out with Gwyneth Paltrow and Sense and Sensibility came out, kind of those mid-90s. And so I decided I wanted to read the original works. Always been a reader, always, since I was a young child. So I started reading her novels and I loved them. So Pride and Prejudice is probably one of my favorites just because I really identify with Elizabeth Bennet. I'm the second of 4 daughters instead of 5 daughters. And
same here, by the way.
Oh, are you? I didn't know that. I didn't know
second of 5 daughters.
Okay.
And there's a boy and a son. So yeah,
I've got no boys. Ours was all girls, but only 4 of us. But I also really identified with her. She's, she's independent. She loves to read. She likes to explore things. And so I identified with her personally as a young woman. And so I loved her books, but I'd read the novel multiple times. I'd read all of Jane Austen's novels multiple times. But I actually did not know about fan fiction, as I said earlier, until probably the early 2000s. And I don't even remember how I came upon it. I was Googling something or searching something on the internet and the story came up and I decided I'd read it. And I found that there's all these forums, these online forums for fan fiction stories. And some of them are just little novellas. Some of them are short stories. Some are full length stories. And that's when I started doing reading them online. And some have been published, but most were just online at this point in time. And so I was single and looking for romance in different places. And of course, Pride and Prejudice is very romantic. As much as there's social satire in it, it's also very much a love story between Darcy and Elizabeth. And so as I started reading different ones, I became enthralled with the way you could change the story. Like what happens if you you interrupt Hunsford, or what happens if there's a forced marriage, or what happens when, Elizabeth is kidnapped as a child and raised by somebody else. Like just all of these like crazy ways to change the story. Some are obviously more believable and better written than others, but just started really enjoying it and decided I could maybe write one of these. Sure, why not?
This is your first book?
This is the only thing I've ever written.
Wow, that is amazing because it's lengthy. This is not just a little short story.
And they cut it down too quite a bit.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. How long did it take you to write this?
So it probably took me a couple of years because I didn't work on it full time. I mean, I have a full-time job as a dental hygienist. I've been doing that for 20 years. And so I would write when I had time on evenings, weekends. I had to do some, little bit of research just because there's Regency etiquette, especially with the titles. How do you address certain members of the peerage and of the aristocracy? What are inheritance laws and things like that? So I did a lot of that again online, just because we don't have, I don't have access to some of those volumes like Debrett's and some of those things that they have in England that outline those things. And I just kind of would write a little bit at a time and post it. I posted it on one of these forums as I wrote it. So most of the time they'd be, a month or two apart potentially. And that's, I think, why it was longer initially, because you write and you kind of recap a little bit for your readers. And so when you're in the editing process, they took a lot of that out. But it probably took me about 2 years. I finished posting it in 2008, and I really didn't think about it for a couple of years. Well, actually over a decade. And then in 2019, a publishing company reached out to me and asked me if I wanted to publish it as a book. And I said, sure, why not? It's just been kind of languishing there online for, more than 10 years at that point. And that's kind of where the book form came from.
That's awesome.
They actually reached out to me. Yeah.
That's really something else, because most people don't get published. Well, they either end up self-publishing, kind of like what I did with my little book, which is about a fourth of the size. And then, it's hit or miss whether you sell anything. Okay, so here's a question. Is the BBC version your favorite movie?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Hands down. I mean, that was the first one. Yeah. I mean, it's not only really true to the book, but just so beautifully made. It's longer, so they can do a better version of telling the story, not have to cut as many things out. The Keira Knightley version, it's all right. I think they made the Bennets too poor, with pigs running through the house, and that is not how I have ever envisioned. I know they were genteel, poverty, but they were still low aristocratic kind of, they were gentlemen and ladies. So the Bennets, I just don't see, like I said, livestock in the house. So that always kind of bothered me. And they changed that whole scene at Hunsford. It was, and I don't know, it was a little bit too different for me as a movie form, but knowing it's not supposed to be a variation, it's actually supposed to be the book, which I think if you're a lover of the book, that I think is a little bit deceptive. And so if you were to read the book, you might, I don't know, be disappointed or something like that. So yeah, Colin Firth, 100%.
Well,
so romantic.
As I was, Colin Firth is always going to be.
Yeah.
I'll watch him in anything just because he's Darcy.
I know.
It's funny, when I was reading your book, one of the things I love about it is that you have so many of the original lines in there. And so that was a lot of fun. But and you don't give a lot of physical description of the characters, which I like, because honestly, mostly I was picturing the BBC characters, but then about halfway through that changed a little bit. Like I started adding my own little imagination to it. And it was fun because some of the hairstyles that you described for Lizzie, like at that one, hairs to the side, I'm like, now I'm picturing someone different. That's one of the reasons why I like it when authors don't give too much description of characters. Places is one thing. I like that. But characters not so much, because, maybe a little hint like hair color or stature, that kind of thing. But otherwise, it's kind of nice to just have your own idea.
Be able to visualize it yourself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yes.
And
No,
so it was a lot of fun, and all the characters are back, all the ones you love and hate.
Yes.
And you had some really interesting endings for a lot of them, and some scenes that some people like me will say, yes, you did that, without giving it away. There are some characters that, of course, we all hated from, or you love to hate the characters.
Right.
From the
Right.
original. And I always think, I read the book, but it's been so long that I always refer back to the BBC version, because that's what I've seen that so many times. That those characters that were terrible, you're so glad to see.
They do most of them get their comeuppance to some degree. Yeah. And that's kind of that's a fun thing to do. Especially again, as a lover of Jane Austen and her novels, like it is fun to rewrite a little bit of the story how you wished it would have ended. Because she's actually pretty, I would say for the most part, a lot of her villains don't actually get real justice sometimes. And so it is fun to exact a little bit of a harsher punishment on some of them.
It is. And and one of the characters that you introduced, a new character that ends up being a villain, which that's not I don't think that's giving too much away.
No, it's not. You're fine. It's way at the end of the book too. It's like the last couple chapters.
Oh, yeah, there's a pretty good twist to the end there that you'll enjoy reading. But one of the, he's a bad guy, and he doesn't really get his comeuppance because that back then people were so concerned with their reputation,
right,
that they don't want to sacrifice their reputation. Now, how do you pronounce it? The group of people that are all getting together that are the wealthy.
The tone.
Like,
yeah, that's why it's italicized, because it's actually a French term, so it's the tone.
It is the tone.
Yeah, the London tone.
Because I always thought, whenever I've always read books like that, it's like the ton, and then you just picture a lot of people. And it's like a heavy people, right? But the tone, what does that even mean in French? Do you know?
I don't actually remember, and I've looked it up, and I don't think that there's actually a really good etymology for it, to be perfectly honest. Similar to like Noel, the name, the Christmas term Noel, there's not a great etymology for that either.
Oh,
because
there's
not. It had just been used for such a long time that a lot of the original, the origin of it has been lost. So I'm not exactly sure what the original French meaning is, but because they don't actually use it in France. It's definitely used to describe the London city. Mm-hmm.
That's interesting. So they adopted it, and
yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So yeah, it's interesting to. It's okay if I throw out there that, because it's I think it's on the back of your book in the description. Tell us, what is the main twist that makes a difference?
Okay, so the variation that I decided to go with is, as I've read a lot of different types, one of the things I liked is when Elizabeth and Darcy at some point have some equal standing in society and finances. And how would that relationship progress if Lizzie wasn't poor and Darcy wasn't so wealthy and so well connected. So the premise of my story, and it's in the first chapter, so you're not giving anything away by stating it, it's in all the blurbs, is that Mr. Bennet, through relatives that were unknown to the majority of the family, inherits a dukedom, which is the second highest title in the British peerage after the monarchy, after the queen, and the princes and princesses. So the dukes are the next level, right under the actual monarchy. So it's one of the highest titles in the land, and it's also a very wealthy title. And of course, with that comes a lot of change in circumstances for the Bennets. They are now they're actually not even equal to Darcy. They are elevated above him, because Darcy is, of course, untitled, even though he has relatives who are titled. His uncle is an earl, but he himself is not titled. And they're an ancient line, but they're an untitled line. So I just thought it would be fun to make Elizabeth and the Bennets actually higher in status and wealth than Darcy. And that's the main change of the book. And it starts from the very beginning and goes on from that point.
Yeah, I love that, because I love the idea of putting them on equal footing, especially because, so many of the books from back in the day were about the man sweeping in and, rescuing the woman, or, saving her from their terrible circumstances. And in the original, they are in pretty bad straits because they have all daughters, no one can inherit. Right. And so if they don't marry well, they're not.
There's nothing they can do. There will be, and very much impoverished the rest of their lives. And I also, I did make the change in status happen after Darcy and Elizabeth have met. So they've had their initial prejudices. They've had their the pride of Darcy and the misconceptions, and Wickham's already been introduced and all of those things. So it happens, it even happens after Hunsford. So he's even, proposed to her the first time and given the letter. So she, they've had a lot of those experiences first. So before the change in status happens. So then it's a matter of, can he still win her after she has, no reason to necessarily like him. And she has a lot of other people who are going to be vying for her attention because she's wealthy and connected now too. So,
Right.
So yeah, it happens right after Hunsford. That's when they find out about the inheritance.
Yeah, I like it that you started there instead of, at the beginning, and put them on equal footing at the beginning.
Yeah, they need to have that. I think Darcy and Elizabeth at some point need to have that confrontation where because he is prideful and that does need to be knocked down, and she is quick to judge, and that is a character flaw that she needs to overcome. And that's one of the things I like about both of them, is that they're willing to overcome those character flaws. This is just, how do they overcome them in a different way? Yeah.
Right. And also a lot of it is told from his vantage point.
Yes.
So we get a lot more on what's going on in Darcy's mind. And so it's kind of fun to watch, because from the beginning that he is in love with her. And
right.
So now he knows he's going to also have competition.
Right.
And so he realizes that the bar is all of a sudden set a lot higher.
Right.
In a way. And so it's neat to get his perspective on it, and to see the competition, because there is competition in the book.
There is some competition, yes.
And there's even some fencing.
Yes, there is. There's some fencing. I did have to do some research about fencing. I have never fenced. I've never seen fencing. So I did quite a bit of research about different styles of fencing and terms that they used and that kind of stuff. And fencing was, of course, a huge sport back then. It's certainly died off in our modern age, but it was also a form of exercise for gentlemen. In a way, they stayed fit and trim. So in a way, they competed with each other. Yes.
Yes, it was.
Yes, there's a fencing scene.
It was a fun scene, and also it was near the time when they had the really neat sleigh ride. So
yes.
I really enjoyed that. It's fun knowing you, because usually when I pick up a book, I don't know the author. I'm always like looking in the back going, trying to figure out what this person's about. I don't know if you do that with books, but I always am curious whenever I read. As I'm reading, I always like try and figure out, what this author is about. But already knowing you, It was fun, because I'm like, oh, this is Noell writing this. This is cool.
But it's a Noell from like 15 years ago too. So, I mean, my life has changed so differently from when I wrote this. I mean, I've met my Darcy now, and I'm married and have some children, and he is not Colin Firth. I love my husband, but he is not Colin Firth. And that's okay. He's actually blonde. He's not even dark hair. And so it is very, when I read it initially, again, when my publishers had sent it to me and I needed to read through it the first time, I'd forgotten some of the things that I had written. And I can see that I was younger and I was looking for that romance for sure. Cause I will spoil it a little bit and say it's not a deep book. There's lot of fluff. It's very just kind of romantic and lighthearted for the most part. There's not a lot of angst. There's a happily ever after. And that's what I was looking for, I think, at that time when I was in my, early to mid 20s. And I think I would write a different book now, and I have another idea for one. So we'll see. I don't know how long it will take me, because I don't have very much time, free time. But I do think I would write a very different book now, just because I've had different life experiences.
That's what I was going to ask you, because while I was reading the book, I knew, because you had told me that you had written it when you were single. Yeah. And I was thinking, I wonder what she thinks now that she's been married, and she's because it is very romantic and it is idealistic, and not that that's not enjoyable, because it is. I still like it, and because I'm single, it kept putting me in mind of different guys that I'm, kind of talking to and things. So, your mindset is different now.
Yeah.
So you would write it differently, probably.
I think I probably would. I don't know how necessarily I would write it differently because that book is written, so it's not like I'm going to rewrite it. But if I try my hand at another one, I do think it would have a different voice. Just like I think, so Persuasion was Jane Austen's last book. Pride and Prejudice was a little like more toward the middle of her writings. And Persuasion is a much more mature, a much more nuanced book than Pride and Prejudice, certainly than Emma. Emma is one of her first books, and it's very lighthearted. It's very, there's a lot of silliness in it too. But Persuasion has a lot more, I think a lot more strength to it. And so if who would have known what kind of book she would have written if she had lived past her 40s and hadn't gotten sick and died so young. So it is interesting to reread your own work and discover like, wow, I was a different person back then, and I've definitely changed. So it'll be interesting to see if I do anything, what would come of it now that I'm older and have changed.
Well, what are you thinking for the next book, or do you not want to say yet?
I actually had this interview question from one of the blogs. The only thing is the working title is called The Godmother. So, and I had thought about it years ago, but I see it going a different way than I had originally maybe outlined. And I lost my original outline, so I don't remember everything that I had been thinking and which direction I was going to go exactly. So, so that's the working title, but we'll see.
So did you outline the first one, or did you just take it chapter by chapter as you were writing it?
So I outlined it a little bit. I certainly outlined some of the family tree because I needed to do that for the inheritance. And then there were a few chapters that I outlined more specifically, but I kind of just wrote it as I went along. And that's part of the editing process. Like as I edited it for publication, there was definitely things we took out, things we changed, things we moved, just for the flow of the story. Also, there were words I used that were like terms that they didn't use until the 1850s. So I didn't use anything super modern, but there were some things that weren't Regency period. And I didn't even think about that when I was writing it originally. And just, again, so I wasn't redundant. So I wasn't repeating myself too often, using the same words too often, that kind of stuff. So as you go through the editing process, things certainly change too, which is it's an interesting journey to have a book edited by other people, like as you're working together with them. And sometimes I said, no, I think this needs to stay. And plenty of times I was like, okay, yeah, we can cut that. That's fine. So you don't really know exactly until someone says, oh, this isn't working. Like why don't we rewrite this scene or add at least a few lines of conversation and dialogue to make it work better. So it's kind of tricky, but it was actually fun. It was fun to edit it and work with some other people and get their perspectives on your writing.
It's good. It is hard when you're just reading it yourself without a third person to tell you, because especially if you've read it several times already, you miss things.
You do.
It's because you've seen it so many times, it doesn't even occur.
Yeah, you've reread it and sometimes you even almost breeze over things because you've read it so many times and you know what's coming next. And so you don't realize that, it doesn't fit or it's redundant. So, yeah. I
know my writing's like that. I use the same words over and over and I have to go back and say, okay, there's got to be a different way to do this. And I teach, and my students, I grade papers, and I'm always telling my students, if you would have just had somebody else read this before you turned it in, you would have saved a lot of mistakes.
Yeah.
It's too easy reading our own stuff. It's too easy to just, like you said, gloss over it.
Yeah, I always had my mom proofread all of my high school essays. She was a great writer too. And so I always had her do that because you just need that second pair of eyes to make sure things make sense and that you haven't repeated yourself and that you didn't leave out a whole sentence or something.
Right.
Like that.
So it sounds like you came by your talent naturally. If your mom had it, but also you're a great reader, right? So I think that bookworms have the advantage over non-bookworms when it comes to writing, just because we're so used to reading that the words flow more freely, I think.
Well, you have a higher vocabulary. You have an idea of how books are formed, how sentences and paragraphs are formed, that kind of stuff. So I agree with that. I do think that people who read are able to be better and writers and it comes more easily to them. I am still impressed by anyone who writes a book from whole cloth. So I obviously took characters and even a storyline. Sorry, this is my 3-year-old. Just say hi and then go run and say hi to daddy. Okay, go to daddy. Thank you. So that's amazing talent to me, to just come up with a story completely from nowhere. I mean, that's incredible. So I do feel blessed that I had the framework of Jane Austen's great characters and Jane Austen's wonderful storyline to begin with. And I just think, anyone who does anything creative, whether it's writing or painting or music or like coming up with new recipes or, anything that is creative is an amazing talent. And we should all express that in any way that we can. Even podcasting. I mean, that's a creation too. So I think that's all important in our life right now.
All right. Well, we will wrap it up because you have a 3-year-old that wants to.
I have a 3-year-old whose father is supposed to be holding back and is not.
Just tell us, first of all, I highly recommend it, especially to you, Jane Austen.
Hey, just sit with mommy really quick while we
and
finish.
Pride and Prejudice fans.
Yeah.
It's all that this entails. And where can this be found?
So it's on Amazon. It's the only place that you can purchase it.
Okay.
There's a Kindle version and there's a paperback, and the audio book. They just finished recording it, so we need to kind of go through that, and that will be available after the first of the year. So I'm excited for that because I know there's some people who only like to listen to a book. So yeah, Amazon.com.
All right. Thank
And
you.
Quills and Quattros is my publisher. They're amazing. So if you're interested in other Jane Austen fan fiction, they have a ton. The owners of the company are both authors of fan fiction themselves, and they have some amazing stories. And then they've brought into their fold a lot of other fan fiction authors. So Quills and Quattros, they have a Facebook page as well as a just a regular website, and they do a fabulous job with bringing these kind of stories to market.
Awesome. Well, keep us posted on a new book. And,
I will.
And everyone go out and find this book. If you might be able to get it by Christmas. If you do a Kindle, definitely. Or it's just a good read for the end of 2020 to take your mind off of everything else.
It's just light and romantic and Mr. Darcy. I mean, you can never go wrong with Darcy, right? We all need a little more Darcy in our lives.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Noel. Thank you for listening to Annette on Life, Liberty, and Happiness, which can be found on youtube.com/Annette Talks, iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, etc.